All right, so who are chronic non-responders? Chronic non-responders are students who have not shown even marginal progress with conventional interventions. These are students who continue to fall further and further behind, and these are also students who continue to test in the bottom half of the bottom percentiles on measurements of fluency, word recognition, and reading comprehension. So again, your chronic non-responders are the students that just aren't having any success. No matter what resources, no matter what strategies you use with these students, it just doesn't seem like it's ever enough to help these students get caught up. Okay, in terms of what we call America's low literacy umbrella, your chronic non-responders are going to be those students testing in the 0 to 15th percentile. They fall into categories such as mild autism, emotionally handicapped, mild mentally handicapped, learning disabled, speech, language, hearing impaired, your ELL and ESL students, remediation resistors. I like that term because it's kind of an umbrella term. It places it's got broad applicability. And then you've also got your alternative education students. So all of these groups of students are going to be students that fall into that non-responder, chronic non-responder category. And these are the students that failure-free reading works most effectively with. The umbrella that we showed in the previous slide closely resembles the RTI model. If you look down at the base where your tier 1 students are, these are students that need minor instructional changes in order to get to a place where they're on grade level or they're working successfully with their peers academically. When you transition into Tier 2 and Tier 3, there's a need for more moderate and in some cases even more significant instruction. That's where failure-free reading comes into play. There are a ton of programs available to help students at that Tier 1 level. And there are a lot of good programs to help students around the bottom half of Tier 2, and these are students that do have some base of reading ability, familiarity with the reading process, with the successful reading process. And then when you transition into Tier 3 in special ed, those are the students that are severely struggling. They typically haven't had enough exposure, successful exposure to the reading process to enjoy success and to be good at it and to really understand what reading encompasses. And so those, again, are the students that we work most effectively with. Dr. Lockovich has identified 3 specific characteristics of chronic non-responders. The first characteristic is PD, which stands for phonetically deaf. When I started working with the company about it'll be 6 years ago in February, the PD piece was kind of controversial. It was that challenging term that you kind of throw on the table to see what the temperature in the room is and who's really going to respond and who's going to be resistant to it. But as I've worked with the company and I've spent more time with various schools and school districts across the country, phonetically deaf is a concept that more decision makers or more administrators and more state level decision makers have come to accept and respect. The bottom line is not all students respond successfully to phonics-based instruction. Some students were born with a 10 ear for sound. They show very little to no success with phonics-based interventions, and they need an alternative to a skills-first approach. These students tend to be more visual learners than they are auditory learners, and I'm sure that you've all had this experience in the classroom. Students that are phonetically deaf or phonetically disadvantaged, as I like to say, they get so hung up on the pronunciation of words and the articulation of sounds that they can't even get through a full sentence or a full passage and be able to tell you what took place in that sentence or passage. They tend to get really frustrated with the reading process, and because they haven't had a lot of success in reading remotely close to grade level, they continue to struggle. And what we tend to do from an intervention standpoint is we tend to give these students more and more phonics at a slower and slower pace. All right, the second characteristic of chronic non-responders is ED, stands for environmentally denied. These students typically have had limited exposure to academic language. They often get little to no academic support at home, And more often than not, with a lot of the students that I've worked with in the past, it's families that are limited in resources for tutoring or for unique life experiences. It's not all rooted in a socioeconomic issue, but a lot of the students that we tend to work with that have these that are struggling with their reading ability are students that come from backgrounds where academic language isn't frequently used in the home. They haven't been exposed to trips to various places. They tend to not travel too far outside of what they call home. And because they're limited in that exposure, they're limited in their ability to understand what we're trying to introduce in the academic environment. They can't really relate to a lot of the terms that we're introducing, so they continue to struggle, which suggests that being successful with reading has a lot to do with exposure and practice, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the presentation. And then the last characteristic is LD, and that particular acronym is going to stand for language deprived. Many chronic non-responders come from homes where standard English is not always spoken. This represents your ELL students, of course, but it also goes back to those students that come from those low socioeconomic environments. If they haven't had a significant amount of exposure to academic language, they're not going to be as successful as we would like them to be in the academic environment. I believe that the same is true for any other specialized area. If you don't understand the language of medicine, you're going to have a tough time being successful as a doctor or a nurse. If you don't understand the language of sports, you're going to have a tough time being a coach or a general manager. So the students that come into school at a deficit because they haven't had the practice and they haven't had the exposure to the language, they're typically going to struggle when it comes to reading in the classroom. All right, I'm going to take a second to unmute all the lines because I want to make sure that everybody can hear me. Can everybody hear me okay? Just everybody give me a little bit of feedback. Is everybody hearing the presentation okay?
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
I hear you.
Excellent. Am I on track so far?
Yeah.
All right, I'm talking about your kids?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, we'll proceed. All right. So here are some of Failure-Free Reading's key reading research facts. Number one, we are underestimating student ability. Guys, there are an abundance of reasons why a student consistently tests into the bottom 15th percentile, and not all of those reasons are related to cognitive limitations. Most school-age non-readers, and I love this thought concept, most of the students that you work with in your classroom are more familiar with iPhones, iPads, Facebook, downloading music, downloading movies. They are more familiar with those things, and they tend to provide you with assistance in those areas as opposed to you kind of being the expert on those different things and introducing the students to those concepts. So with that being said, if these students are capable of understanding today's technology better than the professionals that it's designed for, then chances are they're very capable and they're very smart. And this is something that you know when you're working with your students. Now, we do have some students that struggle with cognitive limitations, but even those students tend to be a little bit more familiar with technology because it's so much the culture. And the reason why they are successful in the use of that technology is because of exposure. They play with it all the time. A lot of these students they don't know the world without all of this modern technology, the smartphones, the tablets, things of that nature. So these students are totally capable of learning what we're trying to teach. It just means that we have to identify an approach that works effectively for these students. Number two, all reading programs work, but they don't work for all students. Research suggests that the mean failure rate for any program, regardless of the approach used, is roughly 30%. And then lastly, the brain does compensate. We can build on a student's strengths instead of trying to rehabilitate their areas of weakness. All right. So here's some keys to reading success for chronic non-responders. What is the problem? Hopefully, as teachers, you feel comfortable and you feel confident in knowing that the problem is not necessarily the teacher. Part of what prevents us from reaching chronic non-responders tends to do with approach and the instructional materials. So what does failure-free reading do? Failure-free reading teaches your chronic non-responders to become automatic readers. And how do we go about helping your students to become automatic readers? We use a process-first approach to reading. I want to briefly give you two scenarios to think about. I won't open up the mics because that'll just make things complicated. I want you to think of a scenario where I, as an instructor, want to teach you, the student, how to ride a bike. And I'm going to use two different approaches to teach students how to ride bikes. The first approach is going to be that I'm going to take you out into the garage where all of the pieces of the bike are spread out across the floor, and they're all neatly labeled in alphabetical order. And I'm going to say to you that before you ever get on a bike and actually ride it, in order for you to be a successful bike rider, you have to be able to identify all of those parts and tell me their names, explain to me what their function is, and then we're going to put this bike together, and then we're going to teach you how to ride it. Or I can take you out into a not-so-populated area where there's not a lot of traffic and put you on the bike, give you a couple of key important instructions that you'll need to remember while you're riding the bike so that you don't hurt yourself. These are the handlebars. You use these to steer. These are the pedals. You use these to build speed and get the bike moving. This is your seat. You want to try to make sure you remain seated. Balance is really important. If you're not balanced and you're not moving, then you're probably going to tip over. And then I'm going to push you on your way or push you around the cul-de-sac until you get the hang of riding the bike yourself. Once you've had the successful experience of riding the bike yourself once or twice, then I can take you to the garage and I can show you all of the individual pieces. And understanding the pieces makes a lot more sense to you because you understand where they fit into the actual bike riding process. So the first process that I shared with you is a skills-first approach, and then the second is going to be a process-first approach. Failure-free reading is a process-first approach. Our immediate goal is to get students involved in the reading process, getting them to read successfully, to read fluently, to understand what the important vocabulary is, what the important concepts are that are taking place in the story, so that they can get the overall reading experience and get a successful reading experience at that. And then from there, you as the teacher can go in and introduce those skills again, and those skills start to make a little bit more sense to the student. This is one of my favorite slides, but I'm going to try not to spend too much time on it. What we believe is that the base of reading success is going to be language. The base of the entire reading process, the base of literacy is language. And we are introduced to language two ways. First, by listening. When we're infants and then we're toddlers and we're growing up in that whole process, we're constantly being exposed to vocabulary and to diction by those that are around us. They encourage us to listen to and mimic the things that they say, say this, say that, say dada, say mommy, say juice. And then as we get a little older, they start to teach us more vocabulary that's specific to helping us communicate with the people around us and become more aware of our environment. And those two things together, the listening and the vocabulary, they represent that base of language. Without the exposure to vocabulary, it's going to be hard for students to learn vocabulary. If they don't have a language base of vocabulary, then it's going to be very difficult for students to transition into the second tier, which is going to be literacy, the actual use of that vocabulary to understand what's being printed on a page, and then turning around and expressing thoughts and expressing communication by writing. Now, when we look at these different stair steps, you like to think of them as different skills that students are learning individually. But the reality is your most successful students in the classroom, your average and above average students, they have been exposed to all 4 steps of this process from the very beginning. From as early as they can remember, someone has been talking to them, someone has been reading to them, someone has been teaching them new vocabulary since the very beginning. Some sophisticated families, the parents, maybe the father will read to the child while the child is in the womb, or maybe they will play classical music in the room, where the mother sleeps very, very close to the belly, to kind of inundate the child with this information, inundate the child with this culture. So for your average and your above average students, they're getting exposure to this entire process on a regular basis. Reading to children as infants and reading to children as toddlers and trying to teach them how to read once they transition into those 2s and 3s. And then writing, as funny as it sounds, the scribbling that students do on a piece of paper or the scribbling that they do on your walls, to me, that is the beginning stages of the writing process. It's the beginning of students expressing their thoughts and expressing their feelings using a writing tool and a surface to communicate. And so the students that have the most success have had the most exposure to this overall process. Our students, the students that we tend to have not had a lot of exposure to that process. And so they continue to struggle. So all of that being said, one of the most persistent findings in reading research is that the extent of students' vocabulary knowledge relates strongly to their reading comprehension and overall academic success. Bottom line, students can't read for meaning above their language level of comprehension. That is the truth. Students cannot read for meaning above their language level of comprehension. So researchers have identified 3 key bodies of academic English words that students must become familiar with in order to be successful at every level in their academic experience. And those words are rare words, tier 2 words, and most common words. And what I'm going to do is, as I kind of talk through those different groups of words, I'm also going to introduce you to the solutions that are associated with those different categories of words, and I'll share with you a little bit about what those solutions do, how they impact your students, what grade levels and ranges those solutions are going to be effective for, so that you get a better sense of what failure-free reading has to offer, the variety, and how we use unique content and unique instructional approaches to meet the needs of different categories of students. With respect to your most common words, the English language is a highly redundant language. 2,000 of the most common English words account for 90% of all the words used in print in grades 1 through 9. These are words that chronic non-responders must be first taught in order to master. So Failure-Free Reading's core academic series, our elementary solution, teaches 2,600 of the most common words in 270 one-hour lessons. Now, the elementary solution is broken up into colors, and each color represents a grade range. We'll see a chart that reflects that a little bit later as we go through the training. You've got your red level, your green, orange, and teal. Red is going to be pre-first grade level. Green is going to be grade 1.5, and it transitions into the second grade, the higher levels of second grade. Orange is going to be your 3rd and 4th grade level, and then teal is going to start at 4th, and it's going to work up to vocabulary and material that goes as high as 8th grade, but traditionally that's our 4th and 5th grade component. And the elementary solution is going to be a story-based solution. So what happens is every student will be placed in a particular story. They'll take a pre-test for that story, and then they'll go into the actual instructional lessons for that story. We'll talk a little bit later about the instructional process and how it's a 3-step approach. Students will sit with a teacher during small group for scripted instruction. and that's an opportunity for the teacher to introduce vocabulary, talk a little bit about what's going to take place in the story, help the student to build some background knowledge around the story, ask some questions, and then it creates an opportunity for the students to then read some of the passage to the teacher and to their peers. And again, it's an introduction to the overall reading process, helping the student to become familiar with reading, get active in reading, have a successful reading experience. From the scripted lesson, the students will go on to the computer lessons. This is online instruction that very much mirrors what takes place or what has taken place in the scripted lesson with the teacher. There's going to be the introduction to vocabulary. There's going to be the modeling of reading of the passages. The student will have the opportunity to answer some factual questions, and so on and so forth, word recognition activities and the like. And once the students complete the computer activities, then they will move on to paper and pencil independent reinforcement activities. Again, we'll take a look at all of that a little later, but I thought that this was a good time to just kind of introduce you to the process as it relates to the elementary solution. All right. Next are going to be your Tier 2 words. Tier 2 words are the most important words for direct instruction because they are good indicators of a student's progress through school. Failure-Free Reading's Verbal Master Series promotes mastery of critical Tier 2 words found in grades 6 to SAT, ACT prep. So this is going to be a very valuable resource for some of the middle school teachers and certainly for your high school teachers. Verbal Master is a sensational vocabulary development program for higher levels of reading. It's going to be middle school and high school level vocabulary. It's very intensive. Dr. Lakovich has taken it to the next step by creating what we call cluster stories because we wanted to meet that Common Core standard of complex text. That was one of the things that Verbal Master was missing at one point, but that complex text element has now been added, and so it makes the Verbal Master program a much more robust program for helping students to develop vocabulary at the secondary, the middle, and high school levels. The format for instruction of Verbal Master is going to be very consistent with what the students do in the elementary solution, with the exception that the scripted lesson is going to be introduced a little differently. The focus is going to be on the actual vocabulary that will be taught in those specific units. The scripted lesson still involves introducing vocabulary, asking questions, helping students to build background knowledge, but the actual activities will be a little bit different from what you do in the elementary solution. The computer component is going to be consistent with what's been introduced in the scripted lesson. There are going to be a lot of opportunities for students to hear from the computer how words are defined and how words can effectively be used in a sentence. There's going to be a lot of pre- and post-test activity. Your online classroom is going to be able to show you almost on a daily basis the results of the students' activity. And it's just a very high-impact program with a great focus on that secondary level of vocabulary. And then the independent activities are in abundance. There is a student workbook with a great variety of different activities, and then there's also a writing activities workbook that's going to help your students to take sentences and build them into paragraphs, and take those paragraphs and build them into essays. So the writing component of Verbal Master is very powerful for students that have struggled with writing in the past but are at that middle and high school age where they need to quickly develop the skill. It's going to be a great resource that you can build on for helping those students to be successful with writing. And lastly, we have rare words. Rare words are made up of words such as employment, punctuality, and interviewing. These are words that appear in text rarely and are often specific to particular content. Of course, the words employment, punctuality, and interviewing are going to be specific to, searching for a job, having a job. So this is really going to be a resource used for your your high school students who may or may not graduate with the benefit of a high school diploma because maybe they've got some cognitive limitations, they've just got a lot of stuff going on at home, and it's slowed down their growth. They're just not at the level where they need to be, and they're aging out of the system, and they're getting ready to transition into adult living. So Failure-Free Reading has created the Life Skills curriculum, and this curriculum teaches words directly associated to success in career and adult living. The Life Skills program is broken down into different life skill categories. The first one is going to be independent living. It's the blue level. It's going to talk about getting a job, getting an apartment, looking for an apartment in the newspaper, having lunch with a friend, doing some of those things that young adults do. The second component is going to talk about what to watch for on the road. It's going to be driving skills, getting your driver's license, all of those different components that deal with driving. The third piece is going to be drug prevention. It's going to talk about marijuana. It's going to talk about cocaine. It's going to talk about meth, and a lot of those challenging subjects that we have a hard time talking to our students about. This is a story-based format, very similar to the elementary solution, but again, it's very practical application, very practical vocabulary for adult living. And then my personal favorite, the last level is going to be the yellow level, which is employment skills. So that particular level is going to talk about getting a job, what to look for in an interview, setting career goals, which I think is huge for not just older students, but also that's a huge concept to introduce to our younger students. What do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do next semester? What do you want to do next year? Let's write this down, let's make it plain, and then let's figure out how we can work to achieve these goals that you've set for yourself. All right. So now that we've gone through the different vocabulary words, or the different groups of vocabulary words, and I've introduced to you the solutions that will work effectively with those words, now what we need to take a look at is, when we're looking at the instructional materials, what are some of the components of the instructional materials that need to be controlled for in order for us to help our students have success? We've already said that it needs to be a highly structured environment. We've already talked about the importance of giving students exposure to the overall reading process. It's not just decoding. It's not just writing. It's not just reading out loud to hear yourself read out loud. It's an overall understanding. You've got the listening component. You've got the vocabulary. If you understand the important vocabulary in text, then you understand the meaning of the text. You're more able to read successfully, read fluently. And then we can take that reading and that vocabulary and we can translate that into writing. All of that takes place through practice. So what are some of the things that the instructional materials need to include in order to make that practice successful? For our hardest to reach chronic non-responders, one of the first things that you need is ample repetition. Students in our environment need to see words easily 15 to 20 times, if not 70 to 100 times. The lower the student, the more they need to see words used, not just in isolation, but also in text. I think it's very impressive how a lot of our students that struggle to identify words independently can successfully answer questions when they see those words in context. That's powerful. That means that a lot of the work that we've put in up to this point has been very valuable and very beneficial. But there does need to be that constant repetition of vocabulary and adequate word density ratio. How many times are they going to see that specific vocabulary word being used in the passage that represents the lesson for the day? Number two is going to be sentence structure. The sentences need to be simple. They need to be positive, active, declarative. The student needs to be able to see him or herself engaging in what's taking place in the story. Even if it's not something that's very close to their level of experience or of great familiarity to the student. If the student lives way out in the country in a rural area, they're going to have a hard time relating to what's taking place on a train. They're going to have a hard time relating to what takes place in the city. But if we show pictures, if we show video, if we have dialogue, and dialogue is extremely powerful in helping students to develop their reading skills. If we have dialogue with the student, show pictures, share experiences, share video, now that student can make a connection. And when they read these sentences that are active and declarative and engaging sentences that really put them in the story, then they can see how the story is playing out and they understand the concept. They understand a little bit more of what's going on. And then lastly, included in the sentence structure, we want to limit the use of multiple meaning words. We want to limit the use of figurative speech, idiomatic expressions, abundant use of uncommon names, dates, places, and pronouns. The reality is that these are things that make reading challenging for us as adults. So we can't imagine that those same components are going to be effective and successful when presented to students that are struggling severely. And then lastly, we've got story content. Story content needs to be realistic. It needs to be something that the students can relate to. They're going to be a lot less likely to relate to a story about purple space monkeys than they are going to be able to understand a story about, going out to my grandparents' farm. Even for students that live in the city, they've had some exposure to or they've been introduced to farm animals, farm equipment. They've seen it on TV. They've seen it in a video. They've seen it in picture books at school. If we present material that is related to real-life experiences, students can get a much greater grasp on it than if we continue to use a lot of fictional components, a lot of animated characters, and very imaginative type material. And that is especially true for our older students. All right. So what is it that we hope to help your students achieve through the use of failure-free reading? We want to help students increase their vocabulary. We want to help students increase fluency. We want to improve your students' reading comprehension ability. We want to increase word recognition. We really want to increase a student's reading volume rate. I think that we have highly underestimated how important reading volume rate is. If a student is presented with text that is overwhelming, it means that the student has not had adequate exposure and practice to that volume of text. It doesn't necessarily mean that the vocabulary is too complex for the student, but the overwhelming abundance of text is just very intimidating for the student. So with practice and with exposure through the use of a scaffolding approach, taking words and building them into sentences, taking sentences and building them into paragraphs, taking paragraphs and building them into larger stories and then larger stories, students begin to develop that reading stamina that increases their reading volume rate. So now that same student sees an abundance of text in a standardized test and they don't Christmas tree their scorecards, because now they feel more confident that they can tackle that large volume of text. They can tackle that material. And we are all, I'm sorry, I won't say all. I can certainly speak for myself when I say that I tend to be reluctant to engage in an activity if I don't feel like I could somehow be successful at it. A lot of times our students don't engage work, they don't engage activities, they don't engage in the classroom because they feel inferior, they feel incompetent, and it feels ridiculous to them to engage and to try to participate if they don't feel like they can be successful. I see that kind of frustration with students all the time. And then it's not going to be lastly, but included in this list is going to be background knowledge. Again, students can't read for meaning above their language level of comprehension, and reading is absolutely relating. If the students can't relate to the text, they're not going to understand what's taking place in the story, and they're not going to be successful in reading it fluently or reading for meaning. So if you look at this list, all of these things kind of build on each other. In order for fluency to take place, there's got to be a familiarity with vocabulary. In order for there to be comprehension, the student has to understand the vocabulary, and the student needs to be able to read the passages fluently. If there's not a smooth, fluid read of the sentence or passage, then the sentence or passage doesn't make sense, so the student can't comprehend what's taking place in the story. Word recognition is critical for all of the other three components, and then those components come together to help students improve their reading volume rate, and the background knowledge piece could probably go up at the top in a working relationship with vocabulary. As the students expand their background knowledge and they expand their vocabulary, suddenly they become more fluent readers, and they also become effective at comprehending what they read. All right, and then I like to talk briefly about the intrinsic values, because I am a firm believer that if you don't inspire or motivate students, if you don't change attitude, if you don't engage them in a way that they want to work more consistently for longer periods of time, then we can't really get to the other stuff. We can't get to the skills if the instructional approach that we're using and the materials that we're using doesn't cover these 4 very important bullet points. Number 1, is this resource going to increase my time on task? The answer is yes. We have an abundance of materials. The program is very structured. It doesn't require a whole lot of teacher prep time. A lot of what you need is right there for you. It's going to increase the student's time on task. There's the scripted lesson. There's the computer component. There are an abundance of independent activities, so your students will be consistently on task. Is there going to be a change in attitude and behavior? Yes, you're going to see that with a large majority of your students as they continue to have more success and they continue to be exposed to this program or this resource where they're actually enjoying some success. Like they can do it. They can read the passage. They can answer the questions correctly. Next is going to be an increase in confidence, and I think that the third bullet point and the second bullet point kind of run hand in hand. As confidence improves, attitude and behavior will improve. Time on task will improve. So all 3 of those are very much interrelated. And then lastly, we want to close the language literacy gap. Again, we believe that the foundation of literacy, the foundation of success in reading, is language. If the students don't have a base of vocabulary and a relationship with those vocabulary words that helps them to be familiar with text when it's presented to them, they're not going to have the success that we want them to have when it comes to reading. All right, and so now what we will do is we'll take a little bit of time to go through the instructional process and get you familiar with the instructional model, and we'll just kind of see where we are once we get to that point. I want to unmute everybody for a second just to see if everybody can hear me and if you're getting anything out of this so far. So how are we doing so far? Does everybody feel like you're getting something out of this?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to mute your lines and I'm going to proceed to review the instructional process. All right, as I said before, the instructional model for failure-free reading consists of teaching, technology, and text. But before you get to the teaching, technology, and text, the first thing that we have to do is we have to assess our students. We have got to check with our students to determine what their specific reading level is so we can place them in the appropriate grade level of materials. So our diagnostic prescriptive is going to be done on the computer. Once the teachers get access to their user logins and their passwords and they're able to go into their online classroom, the first thing that you do once you register a student is to take that student through or have them launch the lesson to go through the diagnostic prescriptive. The diagnostic prescriptive has 11 entry points, and this is really important if you're taking notes. Those entry points are going to be centered around the most common vocabulary, which is going to be found in our elementary solution, and then your Goldilocks or your Tier 2 words, which are going to be found in our Verbal Master program. So the diagnostic prescriptive is going to place students either in the elementary solution or in the Verbal Master program. It's not necessarily going to place students into the Life Skills program. Life Skills is going to be a more manually managed resource. You can plug students into the Life Skills program using the Edit Bookmark feature. That may not necessarily be something that we get to on this call, but when we go into the technology and when we take some time to kind of train on the use of the technology, then that's when we'll introduce the edit bookmark feature and a lot of other features that you'll need to become familiar with. All right, and the way that the diagnostic prescriptive works is that students will be introduced to fill-in-the-blank sentences with multiple choice options. The goal for the student is to select the option that best completes the sentence. As the student gets these sentences correct, these sentences will increase in complexity. The assessment stops for the student when they have missed too many sentences consistently. So a student misses 4 or 5 out of 6 or 7 sentences, the program is going to say, okay, we believe that this is the student's ceiling, this is their challenge level, so this is where we need to begin instruction. And so the student will then be placed in a story that is centered around that ceiling or that challenge level. So again, students are placed in stories and clusters based on the results of the diagnostic prescriptive assessment. And again, that assessment is going to place students into the elementary solution and verbal master. It's not going to place students into life skills. Okay? Next is the pretest. The pretest ensures appropriate placement and provides baseline data for evaluating student understanding of the story or cluster. So students take the diagnostic prescriptive, they find a challenge level, they have a challenge level identified, and then from that challenge level, what will happen is the student will be placed in a particular story or cluster. Story applies to the elementary solution, cluster applies to the verbal master program. Once they've been placed in that story or cluster, the very first thing that the student will do is take a pretest for that story or cluster. So that pretest is going to make sure that the student has been placed at an appropriate story for their challenge level, and it's also going to give you a pretest. It's going to give you a pretest score. It's baseline data for how familiar the student may be with the story. And then another assessment that is included, it's not going to be included in the progression of the software. So when you enroll a student, the very first lesson that it's going to give you the option to launch is going to be the diagnostic prescriptive. Once you finish the diagnostic prescriptive, the software is going to take you directly into the pretest. This reading attitude adjustment survey does not follow in the flow of that sequence. It's kind of an external assessment that you as the teacher will be able to access through your online classroom. Okay? But what the reading attitude adjustment survey does is it helps us to identify, the question of how does this student feel about his or her success in the classroom as it pertains to reading with respect to his or her peers. How successful does the student feel in the classroom? It's a lot of those subjective questions, those emotional questions. But if we don't know where students are with respect to their confidence in their own ability, it's really hard for us to get them to the next level. We've got to figure out what motivates them. We've got to figure out whether or not the material that we're using, the resources that we're using, do those resources excite the student? Do these resources make the student want to stay more engaged? And the goal is to give the students the reading attitude adjustment survey on the front end, when you begin instruction initially, and then maybe at the end of the semester or at the end of the year, you want to take a RAS post-test to determine, has there been a change in attitude? Does this student feel more successful? Does this student feel more competent? All right, and lastly, again, this is not a software-driven assessment, so it doesn't follow in the flow of the software. However, the criterion reference materials, I think, are a very, very valuable resource for helping our students to be successful with reading. The criterion reference materials are paper and pencil CBMs that provide additional assessment measurements of student growth. And because they are paper and pencil, it's something tangible. The student has to read it. They have to recognize the vocabulary words on the paper and have dialogue with you about what some of those words mean. I really, really feel like it lends itself to be a solid assessment, even more so at times than the software pre- and post-test. So it's very important that you do these criterion reference activities with your students before they go into the story in question. You want to do it after they've completed the pretest and you have decided as the teacher that this is absolutely where you want the students to be. But you want to make sure that you do it before they actually start the computer instruction. So the criterion reference materials include a timed oral reading, word recognition activities, and silent reading activities. And I like to call them fill in the blank, but it's really more of a, please select the best answer. All right, so once you've completed the assessment process, now we move into instruction. What are we going to do with our students on a day-to-day basis? And what instruction looks like is it looks like this small group teacher-guided instruction station, or the small group scripted lesson. And then from there, it's going to go on to the online talking software. We're going to go to the computer activities. And then from the computer, we're going to move on to the independent activities, the reinforcement activities. And the goal is for all of these to be introduced on a daily basis. If you ask me what the ideal scenario is, the ideal scenario is going to be going through each of these stations one time, 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week. Now, I already understand that that is not a reality for a lot of teachers' classrooms. So we work with teachers all the time to customize instruction in a way that's suitable for their classroom. So don't be overwhelmed or intimidated by those numbers, but it is, if it was ideal, if we had the ideal scenario in a perfect world, the students would be going through this process 20 minutes a day for each station. So 20 minutes scripted lesson, 20 minutes on the computer, and 20 minutes of reinforcement activities, and they would do that Monday through Friday. They would do that 5 days a week. So, we'll talk with Bill, talk with myself, we'll talk with Greg, we'll identify some instructional schedules that work well for you based on what you've already got in place right now. All right, I told you at some point you would see a chart for the elementary solution. So here it is, and you see the different color levels and the reading levels that are associated with those colors. You also see some of the content. Red is going to be first grade. That's your Dolch words. Green is going to be second grade master Dolch words. Orange is going to be third grade and fourth grade transferable vocabulary. And then teal is going to be fourth through eighth grade. And that's very age appropriate for those students. It's very encouraging to see your fourth, fifth, and sixth grade students transitioning into the teal level and reading those very engaging stories, reading stories with robust vocabulary, and maybe not being so familiar with the material when they first get started with the story, and then having them get to the end of the story and feel what it means to truly read successfully, with fluency, with comprehension, reading for meaning, and having students being really excited about what they've learned and what's been introduced to them. All right, next is going to be the Verbal Master program. The Verbal Master levels are Verbal Master 1, which is 6th and 7th grade, Verbal Master 2, which is 8th and 9th grade, and then Verbal Master 3, which is 10th and 11th, and Verbal Master 4 is going to be your SAT, ACT prep. All right, this is just a little bit more of a detailed description of Verbal Master. Determines students' current mastery of critical tier 2 vocabulary, and increases students' mastery of that vocabulary. It very much promotes vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, spelling, and written expression. It has the opportunity for you to really give the students practice at the Common Core standard of complex text. And it enhances student dignity, pride, and self-respect. If you've got some older middle school students who are cognitively sharp, but due to lack of exposure, they're just behind in vocabulary. If you've got some older middle school and some high school students that are very sharp and have a tremendous ability to read on grade level, they just haven't been exposed to the material using the right approach and using the right resources, Verbal Master is going to be a great program for those students. All right, so we're going to continue to stick with instruction. Why do we use scripted lessons? Scripted lessons ensure fidelity, they significantly reduce teacher prep time, and they create a failure-free environment. The scripted lesson to me is like the foundation. It's extremely important that we use these scripted materials every time we get ready to engage the students in the program. It's not okay, and I want to emphasize this. It's not okay to just say we're just going to use the computer and occasionally use the independent activities. We don't really see a need for the scripted lesson. The scripted lesson is everything because of the power of dialogue. You as the teacher are still the most important component of this reading, this teaching of reading, this educational process as it pertains to literacy. We need you to be having these conversations with the student, talking to the student a little bit about the vocabulary, talking to them about the content of the story, asking them engaging questions about how these vocabulary words relate to their own personal experiences, and pulling more out of them than just surface answers. We need you involved in the factual and inferential questions. The factual questions are easy because those you can pull directly from the text. But the inferential questions, they demand a little bit more dialogue, a little bit more conversation. And so you want to have that with the students. It makes a dramatic difference. It makes all the difference for your students, for you to be able to take that time to have that dialogue with them and help to expand their thought process and help expand their understanding of what they're reading. So the scripted teacher lesson is very, very, very important. The small group reading where students sit with their peers and they may read chorally as a group. They may read peer-to-peer. You may do popcorn reading. And then you as the teacher taking time to do the review. All of those things are included in the scripted lesson, and it is very, very important. I cannot stress it enough. I have seen schools and school districts where they try to just go at it with the software without the use of the scripted materials, and they wonder why they're not having the success that they want to have. It's because teachers aren't having that dialogue. There is no computer program on the planet that will replace the power of a teacher or a parent or an adult having conversation with a student, introducing new concepts and new ways of thinking to a student just by having conversational dialogue. So if anybody asks me why I feel like the scripted lesson is so important, it's that dialogue piece. We don't grow and we don't learn as effectively and successfully if we're not engaged in that conversation with someone. Okay, why talking software or ASL video software? I'm not sure if you'll be working with any deaf students, but we do have ASL video software that we've worked diligently with Schools for the Deaf to develop. It's not perfect, but it's still an excellent resource. We've got a unanimous vote from all of the schools that we work with that it still needs work. There are some context challenges, and there needs to be a little bit more description. But it's a very effective tool. It's been very effective for the students that we work with in the deaf and hearing impaired environments. So I just wanted to kind of make a little side note that ASL video option is out there for your students. But talking software is going to eliminate a reading proficiency requirement. Through the use of talking software, and having the computer to provide a little bit of that dialogue and explanation to the student, we can introduce material to students that's higher than what their current reading level is. We don't have to settle for a 0.0 grade level, or we don't have to take a fourth grade student reading at a first grade level and only introduce them to more first grade material. We can introduce that student to second and third grade material using that talking software, using that audio support that I'm going to present this information to you and then I want you to explain to me what I just presented to you, using that concept. So it is in itself kind of a function of a dialogue. The student is kind of having dialogue and rhetoric with the computer. But again, it still does not replace that in-depth conversational piece that takes place with the teacher during the scripted lesson. I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. Using the talking software, you get a more age-appropriate appearance. It does add a diagnostic prescriptive element, meaning we can do the tests and the assessments using that resource, and it monitors daily performance. Students are going to get feedback. They're going to get reports on a daily basis because of the availability of the talking software. Why reinforcement activities? Paper and pencil reinforcement activities are going to contribute to that concern about time on task. These activities are going to promote student independence. These activities are going to document student success. And there are an abundance of independent activities that are available with respect to the Failure-Free Reading program. So when you take a student through a particular story, there may be 9 different activities that you can introduce to the student. You don't have to use all 9, but it's important for you to know that those resources are available. And then as we've gone from assessments and pre-tests to the scripted lesson, the computer instruction, and then the reinforcement activities, we land finally at the progress monitoring piece and the post-tests. You're going to have post-tests on the computer for every story and for every cluster. You've got the criterion reference materials where there'll also be a post-test component included in those materials and in that resource. You've got the progress monitoring diagnostic, which is something that we'll look at when we get into a more technical training. And the progress monitoring diagnostic is going to tell us if the student is growing based on the instruction that he or she is receiving. And you'd be very surprised to see how much students grow from the initial diagnostic assessment on into, completion of the first, second, or third story. And it's not so much that we've taught them so much information in a short period of time, but they begin to realize what their real ability level is. And I'm sure that most of you can agree, the majority of the students that we work with in this special ed environment or our low incidence populations, those students don't really have an awareness of what their ability level is. They don't know what they're capable of, and part of that is on the fault of us. When I say us, I mean us as vendors, those who have created instructional materials for the students to use, those of us who have done research to try to identify the most effective approaches. We haven't presented them with material that allows them the opportunity to be successful. So you will be very surprised to see how far along students move and how quickly, once they get engaged in the process and they're being exposed to all of these different instructional components. And then lastly, we've got abundant online reporting. These 4 bullet points are just a fraction of what's available in terms of reporting with failure-free reading. There's a lot of information that we can provide to you, multiple story charts. We've got what we call a student detail. I think it's student detailed instructional report. I can't remember the specific name. Detailed software lesson report, I'm sorry. It would help if I was looking at my slide. Detailed software lesson report is going to break down for you all of the activities that the students are engaged in over the course of a lesson or a series of lessons, and it will show you in bold where the students got answers incorrect. It will help you to identify where the student is having challenges. Maybe the student is good at identifying vocabulary in context, but they have a hard time identifying vocabulary in isolation. And those are some of the things that are really important to know. Those are things that you'll see by taking a look at the detailed software lesson report. Okay? I'm going to unmute the line and see if anybody has any questions. And the reason for that is the slides that are to come just go into instruction in a little bit more detail. This would typically be the part of the training where we transition into hands-on and we start working with the software. But I think that we've agreed that this is something that we may want to postpone for another date so that we can fully engage it and carve out an hour, hour and a half just to focus on the instructional process. So give me 1 second. I'm going to pull down my desktop and I'm going to unmute the line so that we can determine the next step. As soon as my computer decides to cooperate. All right. Sorry about that. Hey, Greg, you still there?
Yes, I am. Good job, Jamal. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Is Bill still on the line, or is he in his meeting? Hey, Bill, you on the line? Okay, I think Bill's not on the line.
Yeah, Bill said he had another meeting to go to. He'd get back to us later.
Okay, that sounds good. So at this point, we've gone through the instructional process. We've taken a look at the concept and the methodology. Does anybody have questions? Is everybody there?
Yeah, I don't have any.
Okay.
No questions from me.
Okay. What we'll do is we will make a link of this training available, and you guys have the opportunity to review it. If you do come up with any questions, just send me an email and let me know, and we will let Greg and Bill kind of decide whether or not they want to proceed at another time with another training, or when they want to proceed with another training.
So, Jamel, do we know right now, are we signed up for it?
You do have access to licenses. That was established this past week. Bill has that information available for you.
Is it different from the license that we've had in the past?
Well, it's not. You don't have the license for the full year yet. I guess that's going to be more Greg and Bill's deal. But you do have access to the program for the next 6 weeks.
You know, I've had a student in this. I've been doing it for 7 years, and I have a student in this program that was on it, and then we had to, of course, take him off because it ran out, and I was the one that precipitated him getting it again. I'm just wondering, if we're back on it, can my student get back on Monday morning and work on it?
The answer should be yes. You do have usernames and logins created, so you just need to check with Bill to get your information, and you can start using the program as early as Monday.
Okay, so let me see if I understand. So my username name and login may be different than what it used to be?
It's possible. I tried to identify teachers who already had usernames and logins, and I tried to make sure that I didn't change those, and I only created new usernames and logins. If you had an old username and login, try it. It should be the same. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email.
All right, sounds good.
Okay.
Was that Regina that was talking?
Yes, it was Regina.
Yeah, hi, Regina. Greg. Yes, I think the username and password should be the same, and I think Bill was going to base, the district's participation upon the enthusiasm or interest from each of the teachers. So I think if you let him know that you want to continue with the program and how many seats you require, I think he's certainly amenable to listening, and that goes for Colleen and Nancy and the rest. So please let him know your thoughts, and once you've determined that, we can reschedule the more hands-on training with the program to help those who may be new to the program to be able to get the most out of it.
Okay.
But all your student information is still on the server, and you should be able to proceed seamlessly from where you left off.
All right, sounds great. I have 2 students on it, so hopefully we can get back to work.
All right. It sounds like you guys are set to go.
Well, we really appreciate all of you participating this afternoon, and we apologize for the glitches and technical issues, but I'm very glad you've had an opportunity. We've had an opportunity to meet with all of you, and Jamal, you did a fine job in presenting the overview, and please let us know your thoughts to us. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
All right. Thank you,
Have
guys.
a good
Have a
weekend.
good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Well done. still there, Jamal?